Hi, I'm Misha, and I watched our chief engineer, a man with a chest full of medals, laugh in the face of a 12-year-old boy while our only tank sat dead in the mud. He had no idea that the lives of our entire platoon were hanging on what that kid knew. That boy was Leo, and he was more of a man than any of us that day. We were the ones with the rifles, the training, the orders, but he was the one with the answer, and they treated him like a stray dog sniffing around the camp. Kitchen. It's a moment that's burned into my memory, a perfect picture of pride staring down a truth it's too blind to see. Have you ever been completely invisible, even when you knew you held the key to everything? Before I tell you how Leo used nothing but his ears and a memory of his father's old farm equipment to diagnose that engine, comment below where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss the look on that engineer's face when the T-72 roared. Back to life. That sound was more than just an engine, it was the sound of justice, the sound of a little boy's courage echoing across the entire front line. It was the moment a ghost of a child became the heart of our battalion, and it's a story that needs to be told, especially for anyone who has ever been told they were too small, too young, or too insignificant to make a difference. Our world had shrunk to a few square kilometers of a bombed-out industrial town. The air was a toxic cocktail of diesel fumes, damp earth, and the metallic tang of cordite. You could never escape the noise. If it wasn't the hacking cough of a failing generator, it was the low rumble of artillery on the horizon, a constant grim reminder that the enemy was close and getting closer. Our fortress was a crumbling garage, and its crown jewel, our only T-72 tank, was dead silent. It wasn't just a machine, it was our shield, our spear, the only thing standing between us and being completely overrun. Without fate, we were just men with rifles waiting for an armored column to roll us into the dirt. The tension was so thick, you could taste it. Chief Engineer Ivan and his two mechanics had been working on it for 6 hours. Ivan was a man who trusted manuals and schematics, not intuition. He was proud, educated, and completely stumped. They had checked everything, the fuel lines, the injectors, the entire electrical system. They'd hooked up every diagnostic tool they had, only to be met with the same pathetic, choking whimper from the engine whenever they turned the key. Finally, Ivan threw his wrench onto the greasy concrete floor with a loud clang that made everyone jump. "It's a catastrophic failure," he announced to Sergeant Kozlov, his voice full of the frustrated certainty of an expert who refuses to be wrong. "We need a full depot repair. This thing is a 40-ton paperweight." That was the moment all hope seemed to drain from the room. And then there was Leo. He was a war orphan, a quiet, ghost-like presence we'd sort of adopted. He'd lost his family in the first weeks of the invasion. Most of the men saw him as a mascot, a sad reminder of the very people we were supposed to be protecting. They'd tell him to stay out of the way, to go find the medic, Anya, who was the only one who treated him with any real warmth. But Leo wasn't just a kid. His father had been the best mechanic in the region, a man who could make ancient Soviet-era tractors sing. Leo had spent his entire childhood in that garage, not playing but watching, listening and learning the language of machines. He didn't understand schematics. He understood vibrations. He understood an engine's breathing. While Ivan and his team were running their useless diagnostics, Leo had been standing near the back of the garage, almost completely still, his head tilted. He wasn't looking at the tank. He was listening to it, his brow furrowed in concentration. I saw him inch closer, his small frame weaving between discarded tools and ammo crates. He reached out a hesitant, soot-stained hand and placed it gently on the engine's cold metal casing, closing his eyes. It was a gesture of such intimacy, like a doctor checking for a pulse. A few of the guys snickered. Ivan saw him and barked, "Kid, get away from there. This isn't a playground. Go bother someone else before you get hurt." The humiliation on Leo's face was instant and sharp. He flinched back like he'd been struck. He didn't make a sound, but his whole body seemed to collapse in on itself. He pulled his hand back from the engine as if the metal had burned him, his shoulders hunching forward to make himself smaller, more invisible. The few soldiers who had been snickering went quiet, some looking away with a flicker of shame, others just shaking their heads as if to say, "What did he expect?" Ivan stood there, arms crossed, radiating a smug satisfaction, the kind of man who enjoyed crushing a fly with a sledgehammer. I felt a hot, useless anger rise in my throat. I wanted to say something, to defend the boy, but in that rigid chain of command, What could a simple rifleman like me say to a chief engineer? My silence felt like a betrayal, and the sight of Leo's retreat into the shadows of the garage is something I'll never be able to unsee. Sergeant Kozlov saw the whole thing. He was standing by the workbench, wiping grease from his hands with a dirty rag, his face a mask of exhaustion. He glanced from Ivan's arrogant posture to Leo's retreating back, and for a second I thought he might intervene. But then he just sighed, a deep, weary sound that carried all the weight of the war. He tossed the rag aside and turned back to the tactical map spread out on a crate. In his world, a world of enemy positions and dwindling ammunition, a boy's hurt feelings didn't even register on the scale of priorities. His inaction was worse than Ivan's cruelty. It was a confirmation that Leo was utterly insignificant, his presence tolerated, but his value zero. Kozlov's silence was an order to everyone else. The boy doesn't matter, the tank does. Leo didn't go to Anya for comfort, not this time. He found a dark corner behind a stack of spare tires, a spot where no one would look for him. He sat down on the cold concrete, hugging his knees to his chest, but he wasn't crying. I could see his face, streaked with dirt and grease, and his eyes were distant. He wasn't replaying the humiliation. He was still listening. He was replaying the sound of the engine's failed start in his head, comparing it to a library of mechanical noises he'd memorized from his father's workshop. While the rest of us were caught up in the drama of human pride and failure, Leo was still on the job. He was a mechanic trying to solve a problem, and the insults were just noise he had to filter out to hear the engine's true voice. It was heartbreaking and awe-inspiring at the same time. Ivan, meanwhile, seemed energized by the confrontation. He and his two mechanics huddled back over the engine, their voices louder now, more confident. They started throwing around technical terms like compression ratios and fuel pressure regulators, a language designed to exclude and intimidate. It was a performance for Sergeant Kozlov, a way of re-establishing their expertise after hours of failure. See? This is complex. This is why you need professionals, not stray kids with dirty hands, Ivan said loudly, casting a pointed look toward the corner where Leo was hiding. They were no longer just trying to fix a machine, they were defending their status. The tank's silence was a challenge to their authority, and Leo had become a symbol of an alternative, intuitive knowledge they couldn't stand. Their pride was now a bigger obstacle than any mechanical fault. Suddenly, the field radio on the table crackled to life, cutting through the garage's tense atmosphere. The voice was young, panicked. Outpost 3 to command. We have movement, I repeat, we have movement. T-80s, at least 3 of them, advancing on the main road. ETA. 15 minutes, maybe less. A cold dread washed over the room. 15 minutes. Every man in that garage did the math. Without our T-72, we were a speed bump. The distant rumble we'd been hearing all day wasn't just background noise anymore. It was the sound of our own clock ticking down. Sergeant Kozlov's head snapped up from the map, his face pale. He looked at Ivan, his eyes pleading. Anything. Ivan just shook his head, his earlier arrogance gone, replaced by a grim, helpless finality. I told you, it's dead. It was in that moment of absolute despair that Leo moved. He uncurled himself from his corner and walked not to Ivan, not to Kozlov, but to me. His eyes were wide, but not with fear. They were burning with an incredible certainty. He tugged on my sleeve, his voice a low, urgent whisper that I had to lean down to hear. Misha, please. They're wrong, he said, his voice trembling slightly. It's not the fuel, it's the air. The engine can't breathe. I know that sound. Papa's old harvester made the same noise when a bird's nest got stuck in the intake. It's starving. He looked at me, his gaze so intense it felt like he was trying to pour his knowledge directly into my head. A bird's nest. It sounded insane, childish. But looking at his face, I believed him. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the desperation, or maybe it was the shame from my earlier silence. I straightened up, took a deep breath, and walked over to Sergeant Kozlov, who was now barking orders into the radio, preparing for the worst. Sergeant, I said, my voice coming out louder than I intended. He turned to me, his expression furious. What is it, Misha? Can't you see I'm busy? I swallowed hard. It's the boy, Sergeant. Leo. He says the engine is starving for air. He says he knows what's wrong. Kozlov stared at me for a long second, his eyes filled with a weary, almost pitiful disbelief. Then he laughed, a short, harsh, humorless sound. For God's sake, Misha, I have an enemy armored column 10 minutes away, and you're bringing me fairy tales from a child. Get a rifle and get to your position. Now." His words hit me harder than a physical blow. I felt my face flush with shame and anger, but what could I do? He was the sergeant. I was just a rifleman. To argue further would be insubordination, and in our situation, that could mean a bullet from your own side. I gave Leo a quick, apologetic look, a silent, "I tried," and turned to grab my rifle from the wall. The other men were already moving, a grim ballet of soldiers preparing for a fight they knew they couldn't win. The sound of the approaching T-80s was clearer now. Not just a rumble, but the distinct, terrifying clatter of tank treads on pavement. Each clank was another nail in our coffin. The air was thick with the smell of defeat before the first shot had even been fired. Kozlov's dismissal of Leo felt like he was dismissing our only miracle. But then, something happened that no one expected. As I turned my back, defeated, Leo didn't retreat into the shadows. He didn't cry. He ran. He shot past me like a small, determined bullet, dodging panicked men who were grabbing ammo boxes and checking their gear. He scrambled onto the side of the T-72, his small sneakers finding purchase on the thick steel plates. "Hey, kid! Get down from there!" Ivan yelled, his voice a mix of fury and disbelief. But Leo ignored him. He was a tiny silhouette against the massive war machine, a child climbing a steel mountain in the middle of a storm. He moved with a frantic purpose that made a few of us freeze and watch, our own preparations forgotten for a second in the face of this utterly insane brave act. He wasn't just climbing, he was heading for the engine compartment at the rear of the tank, moving with a familiarity that was startling. He reached the heavy access hatch and tried to lift it, his whole small body straining against the weight. He grunted, his face turning red with the impossible effort. The hatch didn't budge. He tried again, his fingers scrabbling for a better grip on the cold, greasy metal. It was a heartbreaking sight, this small boy trying to muscle open a piece of steel that a grown man would struggle with. Ivan started walking towards him, shouting, "I said get down!" But just as he took a step, the world outside the garage exploded with a deafening roar. The ground shook violently under our feet, and everything went white for a second. A shell had landed just outside, close enough to make the entire concrete structure groan in protest. Dust and small chunks of plaster rained down from the ceiling, and the single bare bulb hanging over the tank flickered and died, plunging us into the dim grey light of the doorway. The shockwave was a physical force, a giant's hand that slammed against the building and rattled everything inside. The tools on the workbench clattered to the floor, and the T-72 itself seemed to lurch on its suspension. The blast was a brutal, visceral reminder of exactly what was coming for us. It wasn't a distant threat anymore, it was right outside our door, and it was about to tear it down. It was the sound of our time officially running out. The explosion threw Leo from the side of the tank. He tumbled to the concrete floor with a cry of surprise, landing in a heap. My heart leaped into my throat. Anya, the medic, immediately started running towards him, her aid bag bouncing against her side. But before she could even get there, Leo was already scrambling back to his feet. He had a long, bleeding scrape on his forearm, but he didn't seem to notice it. His eyes were wild, fixed on the engine. The blast had knocked a thick layer of caked-on mud and grease from a section of the engine block. He wasn't crying in pain. He was pointing at that newly exposed spot, shouting something that was lost in the high-pitched ringing that filled all our ears. Sergeant Kozlov had been thrown against the workbench by the blast. He pushed himself up, his face ashen. He saw his men frozen, staring at the boy. He saw the blood on Leo's arm. He saw the look in the boy's eyes. Not fear, not pain, but a burning, almost manic certainty. And he heard the enemy tanks, now so close they sounded like they were in the next street. In that moment, something in him broke. Maybe it was the futility of it all, or maybe it was the sight of this child, who refused to give up even as grown soldiers prepared to die. All the rules, all the protocols, all the years of training that told him to ignore the impossible, it all melted away in the face of certain annihilation. He had nothing left to lose. He strode past me, his boots crunching on fallen debris, and pushed Chief Engineer Ivan out of the way without a word. He didn't yell at Leo. He didn't dismiss him. He knelt down in front of the boy, bringing his face level with Leo's, his expression a mask of pure, desperate gravity. The noise was still deafening, but he pitched his voice to cut through it. "Show me," Kozlov growled. It wasn't a question. It was a command, an abdication of his own failed authority and a transfer of it to this small bleeding child. For the first time, someone wasn't just looking at Leo, they were seeing him. The entire garage seemed to hold its breath. Leo, catching his, lifted a trembling, grease-stained finger and pointed. "There," he gasped, his voice thin but clear. "The air intake valve, it's stuck closed." Ivan's face contorted with outrage. He took a step forward, his hand reaching out as if to pull the sergeant away from the boy. "Sergeant, what are you doing? This is madness. We are wasting precious seconds listening to a child's fantasy. The manual clearly states that the main fuel pump is the point of failure. We follow protocol for a reason." His voice was a mixture of pleading and fury, the desperate cry of a man whose world, built on rules and schematics, was crumbling around him. But Kozlov didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes locked on Leo, waving a dismissive hand at Ivan. "Your protocol is a death sentence, engineer. Stand down." The order was cold, final. The chain of command had been shattered and redrawn in that single, desperate moment. Leo didn't use technical terms. He spoke the language of his father's workshop. "The big pipe that lets the engine breathe," he explained. His small finger tracing an imaginary line in the air. "It's like when you try to run with your hand over your mouth. You can have all the energy in the world, but you can't go anywhere." The bang knocked it shut. "It's an old valve, a manual one. Papa said they put them on the first models in case the automatic mixers failed in the cold." He looked up at Kozlov, his expression simple and honest. "It's not broken, Sergeant. It's just sleeping." The simplicity of the explanation was more convincing than any of Ivan's jargon-filled reports had been. It was a diagnosis born of experience, not a textbook. Kozlov nodded slowly, then stood up. "Show me where," he commanded. Leo didn't hesitate. He led the sergeant to the rear of the engine compartment, pointing to a small, unassuming access panel that was covered in so much hardened grime it was almost invisible. It was a part of the machine that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. One of the younger mechanics, emboldened by Ivan's earlier arrogance, snorted. "That's just a maintenance port for the old V12s. It's obsolete, it does nothing." But Kozlov silenced him with a single murderous glare. He took a pry bar from the nearby toolkit and, with a grunt of effort, wrenched the rusty panel off. It fell to the floor with a loud clang, revealing a small grease-caked lever almost completely hidden in the shadows. There it was, exactly as the boy had described, a manual air-fuel mixture valve, a relic of a simpler, more robust era of engine design. It was clearly jammed in the fully closed position. Ivan pushed forward, his face pale with a mixture of disbelief and professional horror. "Sergeant, no. That valve is calibrated at the factory. It's sealed for a reason. If you force that, you'll flood the engine or strip the gears. You will destroy the engine permanently. This is against every regulation." He was practically begging now, his authority completely gone, replaced by a frantic adherence to rules that no longer applied. He was a man watching his entire belief system being dismantled by a child and a pry bar, and he couldn't bear it. Kozlov didn't even hesitate. He looked from Ivan's panicked face to Leo's calm, certain one. Then he looked towards the garage door, where the shadows were dancing from the light of fires on the street outside. The clatter of tank treads was deafening now. They were no longer minutes away. They were seconds. He made his choice. He tossed the pry bar aside and grabbed the largest wrench he could find, a massive, heavy piece of steel. The wrench felt more appropriate for smashing things than for delicate repairs. "Get the driver back in the tank," he yelled over his shoulder. "Tell him to be ready." He positioned the wrench over the stubborn valve, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle. This was it. There would be no going back from this. He put his entire weight into it, his muscles straining, his teeth gritted. The wrench bit into the valve, but the lever didn't move. It was frozen solid, seized by years of neglect and solidified grease. A low groan of stressed metal was the only response. I saw Ivan's face relax into a grim, triumphant sneer. He was about to say, "I told you so." In that split second, all the hope that had surged back into the garage began to evaporate again. It was over. The miracle had failed. Just then, the radio crackled with a new voice, filled with sheer terror. "They're on the street. They're turning towards the garage. God help us, they see us." The finality in that voice was like a physical blow. We were out of time. Just as Kozlov was about to give up, his muscles screaming in protest, Leo's small voice cut through the noise. "Wait, tap it. Tap it hard with a hammer, right on the joint. Papa said you have to wake up the old metal." It was such a simple, almost primitive instruction. It was the kind of advice an old farmer would give, not a trained engineer. Kozlov, with nothing left to believe in, but the boy grabbed a heavy ball-peen hammer from the floor. He swung it once, a sharp, precise blow right where Leo had pointed. There was a loud, cracking sound, like ice breaking. Kozlov immediately put the wrench back on the valve and pulled again. This time, with a painful scraping shriek, the lever moved. It moved with a groan that sounded like a dying man's last breath, a horrible, grinding protest of metal against metal. Kozlov threw his entire body into the final turn, and the lever gave way completely, clicking into its open position with a solid, definitive thud. For a moment, no one moved. Kozlov stood panting, leaning on the wrench, sweat and grease plastering his hair to his forehead. Ivan stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, a statue of disbelief. The radio operator's panicked voice was now just a continuous, terrified stream of updates about the enemy's proximity. Kozlov straightened up, his eyes finding the driver's hatch. He didn't need to shout. His voice was a low, powerful growl that cut through everything. "Start it," he commanded. "Now." Every man in that garage held their breath, our collective hope hanging on that single, desperate command. The driver, a young man named Yuri, who looked no older than 20, slammed his hand down on the ignition button. The first sound was not a roar but a deep, asthmatic cough, a wet, gurgling sputter that made my stomach drop. It was the same sound of failure we had been hearing for hours. I saw Ivan's eyes flicker with a dark, vindicated satisfaction. He was right. We had wasted our last seconds on a child's fantasy. The engine coughed again, a wheezing, pathetic gasp, and then fell silent. The silence was heavier, more final than before, broken only by the sharp crackle of enemy machine gun fire peppering the thin metal of the garage door. In that moment of crushing defeat, I looked at Leo. He wasn't panicked. He was just listening, his head tilted, a faint, knowing smile on his face, as if he was waiting for the second act. And then it happened. A colossal plume of thick black smoke erupted from the exhaust pipes with the force of a cannon blast, instantly filling the garage with a choking, acrid cloud. The engine gave another cough, but this one was different. It was deeper, stronger, a clearing of its throat. It was followed by a low, rumbling growl that vibrated up through the soles of our boots, making the concrete floor tremble. The growl deepened, catching its rhythm, building, in power until it exploded into a deafening, life-affirming roar. The V12 diesel engine of the T-72 was alive. The sound was so immense, so powerful, it wasn't just a noise. It was a physical presence that shook the very foundations of the building and drowned out the war outside. It was the sound of a god waking up, angry and ready for a fight. Through the swirling black smoke, I could see the faces of the other soldiers. Their expressions were a mixture of awe, disbelief, and a raw, primal joy. The mocking smirks and looks of pity were gone, replaced by wide-eyed, stunned silence. They stared from the roaring, vibrating war machine to the small, soot-stained boy standing calmly beside it. But the best part, the part I will cherish until my dying day, was the look on Chief Engineer Ivan's face. He was pale, his eyes wide with a professional and personal horror. His entire world of manuals, protocols, and condescending certainty had just been shattered by a 12-year-old boy, a hammer and a forgotten valve. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a fundamental law of physics being broken right in front of him. He looked utterly, completely defeated. Sergeant Kozlov didn't waste a single second savoring the moment. He was all business, his face a hard mask of renewed purpose. He slapped the thick steel hull of the tank with the flat of his hand, a resounding clang that was barely audible over the engine's roar. "Yuri, go!" he bellowed, his voice raw with urgency. "Get us out of this coffin, pave a new road." The tank lurched forward with a jolt that nearly threw Leo off his feet. Its massive treads, designed for mud and dirt, tore viciously at the concrete floor, sending sparks and chunks of debris flying. Without slowing, it smashed headfirst through the bullet-riddled garage door, bursting out into the war-torn street like an enraged beast breaking free from its cage. It was a terrifying, beautiful sight. The scene on the street was chaos. The lead, enemy T-80, its turret already turning to line up a killing shot on the garage, was caught completely by surprise. Its crew must have thought we were a trapped, dying animal, only to see the animal leap out with its fangs bared. The T-72 didn't hesitate. Its turret swiveled with a smooth, hydraulic whine, its long 125mm cannon finding its target with lethal speed. There was a concussive blast that felt like it sucked all the air out of the garage, followed by a flash of brilliant white light. A split second later, the enemy tank erupted in a ball of orange and black fire, its turret blown clean off its chassis and sent spinning into the air. The tide of the battle hadn't just turned, it had been broken like a dam. Back in the garage, a wild, guttural cheer went up from the men. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, the roar of men who had been staring death in the face and had just been saved by a miracle. They were clapping each other on the back, shouting, their faces split, with grins. But my eyes were on Leo. He was standing in the shattered doorway, the flickering light from the burning enemy tank dancing across his small, determined face. He wasn't cheering. He was just watching the T-72, his tank, pivot to engage the next target. A small, tired but deeply satisfied smile touched his lips. Covered in grease, dried blood, and the dust of his triumph, he looked more like a giant than anyone else in that room. The real victory wasn't just on the street. It was in the heart of that little boy. The two remaining T-80s, seeing their leader obliterated and now facing a fully operational and enraged T-72, didn't stick around to argue. They fired off a few panicked, inaccurate shots that hit the building next to us before hastily retreating back down the road, vanishing into the smoke and chaos they had created. The immediate threat was gone. The silence that followed was even more profound than the noise had been. It was filled with the crackle of the burning. Tank down the street, the distant pop-pop of small arms fire, and the steady, powerful thrum of our T-72's engine, a new heartbeat for our platoon. No one spoke. We just stood there in the ruined garage, breathing in the fumes of our salvation, looking at the boy who had given it to us. The ghost had become our guardian angel. Sergeant Kozlov was the first to move. He walked slowly back into the garage from the shattered doorway, his face streaked with grime, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at the cheering men. He walked right past Chief Engineer Ivan, who seemed to shrink against the wall as he passed, avoiding eye contact. Kozlov stopped directly in front of Leo. He was a big man, a mountain of a soldier, and Leo had to crane his neck to look up at him. For a long, tense moment, they just stood there. Then Kozlov did something I never would have expected. He slowly, deliberately, reached up and unfastened the battalion patch from the sleeve of his own uniform, the worn, embroidered patch that signified his identity, his loyalty, his very place in our world. He knelt down just as he had before, bringing himself face to face with the boy. He didn't say a word. He just held out the patch in his calloused, trembling hand. Leo looked at the patch, then back at Kozlov's face, his eyes wide with a confusion that was slowly turning into dawning understanding. He hesitantly reached out and took it. The gesture was so quiet, so personal, yet every man in that garage understood its weight. It wasn't a medal. It was something more. It was an adoption. It was a formal recognition that this boy, this orphan, was no longer a stray we were tolerating. He was one of us. He was a soldier, in the only way that truly mattered. He belonged. The change in camp was immediate and absolute. Leo was no longer the kid. He was the tank whisperer, a name spoken with a mixture of awe and genuine affection. He was given a corner of the workshop that was his and his alone, along with a set of his own tools, scrounged together by the other mechanics. Soldiers would come to him not with condescending pats on the head, but with broken radios, jammed rifles, and sputtering generators, asking, "Leo, could you take a look?" The most incredible moment came 2 days later, when the field hospital's main generator failed. I saw Ivan, after an hour of fruitless work, swallow his pride, walk over to Leo, and mutter, "Kid, we can't figure it out. Would you come? Have a listen?" Leo just nodded and picked up his wrench. From that day on, Leo had a purpose. He wasn't just surviving. He was contributing. He was essential. The haunted, lost look in his eyes was replaced by a quiet confidence. He still didn't talk much, but he didn't have to. His hands did the talking. He'd found his family in the unlikeliest of places, forged in the crucible of desperation and diesel smoke. He had a home in the heart of that T-72 and in the respect of the men whose lives he had saved. He gave us back our fighting chance, and in return, we gave him back a piece of the world he had lost. It wasn't a fair trade, not by a long shot, but in the middle of that senseless war, it was the closest thing to justice I had ever seen. The story of that day became a legend in our unit, told and retold around campfires and in quiet moments before a patrol. It was our reminder that the most valuable assets we had weren't always listed on the official equipment roster. We learned that courage doesn't have an age requirement, and that genius doesn't wear a uniform or care about rank. The most powerful solutions, we discovered, are often found not in a manual or a computer, but in the simple, profound act of shutting up and having the courage to listen to the one quiet voice that everyone else has chosen to ignore. It's a lesson that cost us our pride, but saved our lives. And it's a truth I carry with me to this very day. If you know someone who needs to hear this message, who has ever felt small or ignored, please share this story with them. Your voice matters even when the world tries to tell you it doesn't. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the most unexpected places. Thank you for listening. The most incredible moment, the one that truly sealed the new reality, came 2 days later. The field hospital's main generator failed, plunging the medics into darkness with wounded men on their tables. I saw Chief Engineer Ivan, after an hour of fruitless work, his face a mask of sweaty frustration, swallow every last ounce of his pride. He walked over to where Leo was carefully cleaning his new set of tools, and in a voice barely above a whisper he muttered, "Kid, we can't figure it out. Would you come have a listen?" Leo didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. He just nodded, picked up a small wrench, and followed him to the generator. In that moment, the war for respect was officially over, and the boy had won. Unconditionally. From that day on, Leo had a purpose. He wasn't just surviving in the shadows of the war, he was an essential part of our ability to fight it. The haunted, lost look that had been a permanent fixture in his eyes was slowly replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. He still didn't talk much, but he didn't have to. His hands did the talking, speaking a language of mechanics and intuition that we had all learned to respect. He'd found his family in the unlikeliest of places, forged in the crucible of desperation and diesel smoke. He had a home in the heart of that T-72 and in the deep-seated respect of the men whose lives he had saved. He gave us back our fighting chance, and in return, we gave him back a small piece of the world he had lost. The story of that day became a legend in our unit, something told and retold around flickering fires and in the tense, quiet moments before a patrol. It was our reminder that the most valuable assets we had weren't always listed on the official equipment roster from headquarters. It was a story about more than a tank. It was about pride and the danger of letting it blind you. We learned, in the most brutal and direct way possible, that genius doesn't wear a uniform, and courage doesn't have an age requirement. The most powerful solutions, we discovered, are often found not in a manual or a computer, but in the simple, profound act of shutting up and having the humility to listen to the one quiet voice that everyone else has chosen to ignore. That lesson is a truth I carry with me to this very day, long after the sounds of the front have faded. It changed how I see the world, how I see people. Every time I see someone dismissed because they're too young, too old, or too different, I think of Leo. I think of the absolute certainty in his eyes and the absolute arrogance in Ivan's. I remember the weight of my own silence when he was first humiliated and the surge of hope when Kozlov finally chose to believe him. That day taught me that expertise isn't just about what you know. It's about knowing what you don't know. It's about understanding that sometimes the most important answers come from the most unexpected places, and you have to be willing to listen for them. If you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone who has ever felt small, invisible, or ignored, please share this story with them. Sometimes all we need is a reminder that our voice matters, that our unique way of seeing the world has value even when no one else seems to recognize it. Your knowledge, your intuition, your quiet truth, it's a powerful thing. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the most unexpected places and the courage to follow your own path. Thank you for listening.